All right. Well, this is the portion of our service that we set aside each and every Sunday morning to devote to Bible prophecy. We believe that we're living in the last days, really the last moments of world history, and this is why we devote the time to look at what the Bible describes as the last days. For today's update, I think I'd be grossly remiss were I not to sort of peel back all the layers of all that's happening here in the United States. And what I mean by that is, while we're embroiled in this battle over gun control, the Middle East has not been on hold waiting for us to work this out. And Bible prophecy certainly has not been put on pause. In fact, I would even venture to say that our issues here in America, and we have issues, have almost become a decoy in the sense that they've distracted us from what the real issue is. I've had a couple of people on a couple of occasions ask me for my take on this whole gun control thing on the heels of Sandy Hook, and I have sort of recused myself from that discussion because there are many who are infinitely more qualified than I on this topic. But that's not to say that I don't have a couple of opinions, which, like armpits, may not smell so good. In fact, they might stink. So that's not going to stop me, never has, from sharing with you my opinion about this matter. I see guns like I see money. They're neutral. Guns, like money, can be used to save a life, and they can be used to take a life. It's what you do with it. Guns are neither moral nor immoral. They're amoral, like money. The most misquoted verse in all of the Bible is in 1 Timothy 6. You know it. In fact, you quote it, hopefully correctly, but it's misquoted, and it's said this way: money is the root of all evil. That is absolutely not true. It's the love of money that is the root of all evil. Well, guns have become so demonized as to become evil. Guns are now the root of all evil. And that's simply not the case. I'm of the belief that the reason why we have this gun control issue and matter is because we've said to God, we don't want you to be in control. And we're reaping that which we have sown. We have said to God, get out of here, get out of the way, get out of the governments, get out of the schools, get out of America. And this is the result of that. God is not mocked. Whatsoever we sow, that shall we also reap. And we're reaping it even now. Well, the real issue is not gun control. The real issue is what's happening not here in the United States, but in the Middle East, in Israel, more specifically, Jerusalem. Years ago, I was in Russia teaching at the Bible college there in Moscow, and I happened upon their wall map there in the dorm. And the students were quick to point out about their map something peculiar. And as I'm looking at it, I'm trying to, figure out, and then it dawned on me as I'm looking at this map that the United States of America is not at the center of this map. And I was deeply offended, by the way, that of course the United States is the center of the world. We're so self-centered here in the United States, right? Well, they were quick to point out that on their maps, where's Russia? Right smack in the middle of their world map. You go to Israel, what's at the center of their maps? Israel is at the, not the U.S. You know who's at the center of God's map? Israel, Jerusalem. This is, as one has called it, the epicenter. And what's happening right now with this so-called Palestinian state, this two-state solution, the Palestinian people, which we looked at in depth last week, is that everything that's happening all over the world comes down to this one issue, this two-state solution. Consider these headlines from just the last few days, all of which seem to have at the core this common denominator of Israel being the problem. Do you realize that Israel to Islam is the little Satan, and the United States of America to Islam is the great Satan? Listen to these headlines. Defiant Netanyahu set to confound critics. Palestinians, apartheid state if Netanyahu wins. Iran, we won't stop enrichment for a second. Netanyahu, Obama and I do have our differences on peace process. Ya think? Benjamin Netanyahu defies Barack Obama to approve more homes. I love the sanctified strength. London warns of perfect Mideast storm, calls for intense peace push. Why? Because of the Palestinian problem. Syria, twin suicide blasts hit south of Damascus. Obama, Netanyahu seem headed for U.S.-Israel clash. Al-Qaeda takes American hostages in Algeria. You've been following this? This is Islam. This is Islam against the great Satan, the United States of America. Americans are the enemy. And why are Americans the enemy? Because we heretofore have supported Israel. Do you realize that a phone call came into the White House after 9/11 to then President George W. Bush saying you need to convert to Islam and stop supporting Israel as a nation? You know, the goal of Islam is to fly the Islamic flag in the White House. This is why I think we do well to revisit the prophecy that's found in Psalm 83 concerning Israel's enemies who are standing at the ready to destroy her. You can go ahead and turn there. We're going to read verses 1 through 8. While you're turning there, if you were to ask me what I thought the next prophecy would be that would be fulfilled, my answer would have to be that it's likely going to be Isaiah 17 and or Psalm 83. Actually, as we'll see here in a moment, they could come to pass in their fulfillment, one in concert with the other. I'm of the belief that both of these prophecies are even now on the cusp of being fulfilled right before our very eyes. There's an overlapping, there's a spilling over between Syria in Isaiah 17 and Psalm 83. Let's read it. Psalm 83 verses 1 through 8. A song of, or psalm of Asaph. Keep not thou silence, O God. Hold not thy peace, and be not still, O God. For lo, thine enemies make a tumult, and they that hate thee have lifted up the head. They have taken crafty counsel against thy people, and consulted against thy hidden ones. They have said, come, and let us cut them off from being a nation. Stop right there. Did you catch that? You know how I've made a big deal about there's no such thing as a Jewish state, that it is a nation, and that when God appeared to Abraham, he did not say to him, I'm going to make you a great state like Texas. I'm going to make you a great nation. It's the nation of Israel. And all of these attempts is a ploy, a satanic ploy to mitigate the nation, the people of Israel, God's chosen people. This is a nation, the Jewish nation, the nation of Israel. And it says that the name of Israel may be no more in remembrance. For, verse 5, they have consulted together with one consent. They are confederate against thee. Now in verse 6 we begin the list. The tabernacles or tents of Edom, and the Ishmaelites of Moab, and the Hagarenes, Gibal, verse 7, and Ammon, and Amalek, the, interesting, Philistines, with the inhabitants of Tyre. Assur also is joined with them, verse 8. They have holpen the children of Lot, Selah. What makes this prophecy here in Psalm 83 so fascinating is that the list of nations or people groups by their ancient names that we have listed here are conspicuously absent from the prophecy in Ezekiel 38. Now, if you're familiar with the prophecy in Ezekiel 38, also known as the Battle of Gog, Magog, to a nation, the ones that are listed here are absent from the list in Ezekiel 38. This is going to be germane to our understanding, as you'll see here shortly. In addition to all of these nations not being involved in the Allied attack on Israel in Ezekiel 38, they're also the very nations that are even now closest in proximity to Israel. So what I want to do, we'll move as fast as we can, is take an in-depth look at who these people groups are. Now, I have to preface this and even confess in this that as an Arab myself, it's not really all that clear. This because really the Arab people, as we've talked about previously, are a melting pot of many people groups today that we just lump in together and call them collectively the Arab people. There are numerous people groups that, if you were to delineate between them, would be known as, by their ancient names, what I like to call all the ites, Edomites, Moabites, etc. Now, by way of example, just to give you an example of how we've just gelled them all together, Egyptians are technically not Arabs. They're Egyptians, but we call them Arabs. Now, if you call an Egyptian an Arab, they're going to take offense to that, because they're very proud that we are Egyptians. We are the ones who invented, not the internet like Al Gore, but math. We invented math. Yeah, I don't know if they did, but I think it was the Jews that were there in captivity that did it. But anyway, they took the credit for it. But the Egyptians are technically Egyptians. How about Iran? A lot of people think that the Iranians are Arabs. They're not Arabs. They're Persians. They don't speak Arabic. They speak Farsi. How about Turkey? You might be surprised to know that Turkeys, well, yeah, they're Turkeys, or Turks, better said. Sorry about that. But they're not Arabs. They're Turks. But yet we lump them in together. Let me give you an example. Think about this. It wasn't that long ago that Turkey was actually an ally of Israel. Now a full-on Islamic republic, anti-Israel. They're the antithesis, and they stand for everything that is against Israel. And they play a prominent role in the pages of Bible prophecy. Be that as it may, I want to encourage you, if you're interested in a further study of this, to go to prophecydepot.net. This is Bill Salas. He does an outstanding work of what I call the who's who of Psalm 83. And for the most part, I think we're pretty much on the same airplane in agreement, but I do differ in a couple of areas from what he identifies as these certain people groups. Now, that said, we're going to go through what I believe to be in what I call the who's who of Psalm 83, and I do so, pardon me, with the hopes that we'll be able to connect the prophetic dots. See, when I know the who's who, that's going to enable me to know what's what. In other words, this is important. There's a reason why we need to know who these people are that are listed here in Psalm 83. It'll give us a clear picture of this prophecy, and in so doing, how close we are to the fulfillment of this prophecy. Let's start with the first one. It's in verse 6, we start off the list with the tabernacles or tents of Edom. Who are the Edomites? They're the descendants of Esau. Esau was another name for Edom. As you know, I'm sure, Esau, the fraternal twin brother of Jacob. Okay? Now, we don't call them Edomites today. They've hijacked, for lack of a better word, the name of the Palestinians, but the fact of the matter is that they're modern-day Jordanians. Now, I grew up in a home thinking that I was, Palestinian. My mother was Palestinian, my father Egyptian, which is why I'm a full-on Arab. But I come to find out that there's a greater likelihood that I might have more of the Edomite in me than I would care to admit. Because as you know, Esau was, you know the story, but the land of Edom today is in modern-day Jordan. Now you have to understand that the boundaries today are not like the boundaries back then when these prophecies were penned. We have Jordan, we have Egypt. Well, back then it was, it encompassed geographically a much larger area, and that's why it lends itself to the difficulty of being able to identify specifically who they are. The second one listed in verse 6 are the Ishmaelites, okay? These are primarily Arabs. However, they are descendants of Ishmael, which would make them, you ready for this? Half Hebrew and half Egyptian. Why? Because, remember, Hagar, the handmaiden of Abraham and Sarah, gave birth with Abraham to Ishmael when they tried to help God out, make good on their promise of a son pre-Isaac. So this Ishmael, if you were to do a forensic analysis of the DNA, what you would find is these Ishmaelites have Hebrew DNA vis-a-vis Abraham. So these are the descendants of Ishmael, and that would make them predominantly Egyptian. Now, there's going to be a distinction here, as we'll see here in a moment, between the Ishmaelites and the Hagarenes, or the Hagarites. Some of you are looking at me like, we'll sort it out. The next one listed in verse 6 is Moab. These are the Moabites. Again, we don't refer to them as such, but they've again taken on the, broad categorization and calling themselves Palestinians. But again, Moab, like Edom, was in what we would call today and know today as modern-day Jordan. So technically, I guess you could say they are Jordanians. If you want to be true to their ancient names, they're actually Moabites. The last one in verse 6, and here's where the distinction comes in, are the Hagarenes, or as some of your translations render it, the Hagarites. Who are they? Well, again, these are the descendants of Hagar. Well, now, wait a minute. What's the difference between the Hagarites and the Ishmaelites? Well, now think it through. Hagar went on to have more children after Ishmael, right? So because they came from Hagar does not make them Ishmaelites, because they did not and were not descendants of Ishmael. So what does that all mean? Well, these are, again, Egyptians. These are Egyptians. Now, the first one in verse 7 we have listed is Gebal. This is the area we know today, in part, as modern-day Lebanon, my birthplace. It's actually the northern part of Lebanon, which would border modern-day Syria. Now, in verse 7, we also have Ammon. So this again, the Ammonites, they've taken the name Palestinians, but also Ammon, Moab, Edom, they're all what we would know today as modern-day Jordan. Now, it wasn't called Jordan back then, so it's a broad term, generic maybe, but we're going to call them Jordanians for purpose of discussion. Also in verse 7, interesting, we have Amalek. These were the most ruthless people you read in the Old Testament. In fact, so much so they were likened unto, in typology, a type of the flesh. Some of the cruel and merciless and downright evil things they did to the Israelites. But these are the descendants of Amalek. The Amalekites. Are there still Amalekites? Yes. But here's the thing. They're a broad melting pot of Arab people. And this is a group that encompasses the greater Middle East. You can't just pinpoint on a map, well, they're from this area. Again, a melting pot, a broad area. Now, interesting, in verse 7, we have mentioned Philistia, the Philistines. Well, wait a minute, Pastor, you just got done telling us last week that there's no such thing as a Philistine. So how come Philistines are mentioned here in verse 7 of Psalm 83? Well, this is why we're doing this today, and on the heels of last week doing an in-depth study of the Palestinian myth. In other words, Philistine and Palestinian are not synonymous. The Philistine or the Palestinian people modern day are not descendants from the ancient Philistines. They are extinct. Well, Pastor, you still have a problem here on the table because you have Philistines mentioned and Philistia mentioned here in Psalm 83. Well, stay with me. I'm of the belief that they're not Philistines, rather they're called Philistines because they dwell on and in the land that used to be called Palestine. Not because of the Palestinian people, but because of the Romans naming it after the arch enemy of the Israel and the Israelites. This again is supremely the Arab people, but listen, they reside primarily in the Gaza Strip in Israel today. This is Hamas, by the way. This is Hamas. These are the Arabs, these that occupy the land, the Philistine land. Thus they're referred to as the Philistines, not because they're descendants of the ancient Philistines, but because they're on the land that at one time belonged to the Philistines. Last one in verse 7 is Tyre. This is clearly Lebanon. Now, according to our maps today, these people dwell primarily on the northern border of Israel, which would make it southern Lebanon. This was years ago. You can't go there anymore, but they call it the Good Fence. Whenever you would tour Israel, you could actually see into Lebanon. That was the closest I ever got. It was back in 1994. You could actually, still at that time even go into Lebanon. You have to be careful, but not so much anymore. Now, the last one on our list is the only one in verse 8, and interestingly, it's Assyria. Who are they? Well, again, this covers a very wide area today that would include the following: Syria and Iraq, and probably, again, in part, Turkey, by the ancient boundaries. This is the area that we would know as Assyria, or the Assyrians. Now, interesting, that's why I believe it's very possible that Isaiah 17 plays into this prophecy here in Psalm 83. Here's the bottom line. It's very plausible that Psalm 83 may find its fulfillment in concert with Isaiah 17, which finds its fulfillment before Ezekiel 38. Now, hang in there with me. Here's how I get there. The nations here in Psalm 83, all these people groups that we just identified, somehow, something has to happen in order to explain their conspicuous absence from Ezekiel 38's prophecy. There's no mention of Syria in Ezekiel 38. There's no mention of Egypt in Ezekiel 38. There's no mention of Iraq in Ezekiel 38. So what happens to them? Well, it could certainly stand to reason that Psalm 83 happens first, which explains their absence in the prophecy in Ezekiel 38. The reason I believe that and say that is because this is the only logical explanation of their absence. The only exception being, in part again, Turkey and Iran. See, one might argue that Iran and Turkey are very prominently listed in Ezekiel 38, and chiefly Turkey is also mentioned in Psalm 83. So why do we see them in both? Okay, it's important to understand that Iran and Turkey are involved only by proxy in this Psalm 83 attack on Israel. Now, when it fails, and it will fail, Psalm 83 will not be met with success, the destruction of Israel. So she's remembered as a nation no more. That will be met with total and utter defeat, and it will be devastating and decimating to the degree in which they are completely taken off the prophecy table and are no longer players in the upcoming prophecies subsequently that take place. Furthermore, every nation that we have listed in these prophecies are even now perfectly postured, exactly as God in His Word said they would. Pictured here, the yellow arrows denote the countries or people groups listed in Psalm 83, and the white arrows denote the ones listed in Ezekiel 38. So once they're off the table, if you will, then comes the Ezekiel 38 prophecy, the attack on Israel. And by the way, these two prophecies have very different purposes. See, the Psalm 83 prophecy is for the purpose of the destruction of Israel, while the Ezekiel 38 prophecy is for the purpose of taking a spoil from Israel, who thinks she dwells securely. Perhaps at another time in the not too distant future, we'll do an in-depth study of Ezekiel 38 and revisit those nations listed in that prophecy, because they're even now also being postured perfectly as we speak. Okay. These prophecies, and this is so important that you hear this and understand this. This is the what's what now that we have the who's who. These prophecies are time sensitive. Maybe I can say it this way. They have a shelf life. And here's why I say that. They're time sensitive and they're geography specific, in that these nations were not in position even 50 years ago. And I'll take it a step further and suggest that not only were they not in position and in place, postured to fulfill this prophecy 50 years ago, it's very unlikely, with the swiftness with which everything is moving prophetically, that they would be in position even 50 years from now, yet future. Even 10 years from now. That's what I mean by time sensitive. These prophecies have a shelf life, and the clock is ticking, and I believe the alarm clock is sounding. You might be wondering why I'm doing this today in Psalm 83, and that's all fine and dandy. It's very thorough and boring and long. But what does this mean to me when the alarm clock goes off tomorrow morning and I go to work and I start my week? Good question. I'll tell you, I'll give you an answer. There's actually another alarm clock that's already going off in addition to the alarm clock that's going to go off tomorrow morning. And it's already sounding, and it's found in, of all places, the Apostle Paul's letter to the church in Rome, where we're currently studying also on Sunday mornings. It's in the next chapter, chapter 13. We're in chapter 12, and I'll close with it. It's Romans 13, verses 11 and 12. Listen to what the Apostle Paul says. Do this, understanding the present time. Listen. The hour has come for you to wake up from your slumber. The alarm clock is sounding. You need to wake up. Don't hit that snooze button like I did this morning at 4:30, thinking it's too cold. I don't want to get out of bed. But I have to. I'm the pastor, so I did. Don't hit that snooze button. The alarm clock is sounding. The hour has come, and we need to wake up from our spiritual slumber. Why? Because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. The night is nearly over. The day is almost here. So let us put aside the deeds of darkness and put on the armor of light. I love the metaphor. When the alarm clock goes off, you get up and you put on your clothes. Well, get up, wake up, put on the armor of light. Why? Because our salvation is nearer now than when we first believed. I believe with all my heart that the hour is now. The time is now. The time has come. Would you pray with me? Father in heaven, thank you. Thank you for your word. Thank you for even the details that we have in your word, not just for the sake of the information, but really the application of that information to our lives. Lord, I pray that we would take all that we've seen here today in Psalm 83 and have it be for us that needed wake-up call, that we might wake up from our drowsiness and spiritual tiredness and slumber, that, Lord, we would wake up and look up and lift up our heads knowing that our redemption draweth nigh. Lord, come quickly. Maranatha. In Jesus' name, amen.